Good morning to all of you. My name is Simon Duguay-Blackburn. I will be the moderator for this video conference organized by Social Justice Connection. Social Justice Connection is a Montreal-based NGO that provides advocacy and advocacy on human rights. The subject of today's panel will be human rights in palm oil production in Indonesia. The panel will be around 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, during which we'll discuss a number of themes, notably past and current human rights challenges in palm oil production and the presence of various elements in corporations and organization strategies to prevent human rights challenges, more precisely questions of traceability, enforcement mechanisms of corporations and companies, and transparency. So we will conclude this channel with a discussion on other solutions that could be and should be undertaken in order to promote the production of a palm oil that is socially sustainable. So before diving into the first theme, I would like each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Mr. Eric Gottwald, then Mr. Savi, and we'll finish with Mr. Pai. Mr. Gottwald.
Thanks, and good morning or good afternoon or good evening to, to you guys. My name is Eric Gottwald. I'm the Legal and Policy Director at the International Labor Rights Forum. We are a NGO based in Washington, D.C. that promotes labor rights in global supply chains. I've been working in the palm oil sector in Indonesia since 2012. I've had the chance to be on plantations in northern Sumatra and Borneo. ILRF is a member of the Palm Oil Innovation Group, where we work with various companies and NGOs to promote innovation and high standards in the sector. So I look forward to this discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. We'll continue with Mr. Savi from the RSPO.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for the invitation. Hi, everyone. My name is Stefano Savi. I'm the Global Outreach and Engagement Director for RSPO. I'm based out of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where I've been working with RSPO for the last 5 years. RSPO, or the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, is a global multi-stakeholder not-for-profit organization that unites stakeholders from the different sectors in the supply chain of palm oil, from the growers to the processors and traders, consumer good manufacturers and retailers, but also the investors and some of the social NGOs and environmental NGOs that work on the issues related to oil palm cultivation. And RSPO sets a standard that is a voluntary standard for the industry that is based on the principle of consensus. And so we work with a vision of transforming markets to make sustainable palm oil the norm. So in my role as Global Outreach and Engagement Director, what I do is to basically promote market development of RSPO, and especially make sure that there's increased demand for certified sustainable palm oil.
Great. Thank you very much for your participation, Mr. Savi. We'll continue with Mr. Pai.
Yeah, hi. I teach Southeast Asian Studies at Bonn University, and I've been working on the palm oil industry for the last 10 years or so, with research in North Sumatra, West Kalimantan, and Sabah, but also in places where migrant workers from Indonesia come from, who work in the palm oil industry in Malaysia. Yeah, so I'm mainly interested in labor currently, and labor organizing strategies, and pretty critical of the RSPO.
Okay, good. Thank you for your participation, Mr. Pai. Okay, so in this situation, since we have all panelists, we've presented all panelists, I think we will start with the first theme, which is a presentation of past and current human rights challenges. So as you all know, various reports have been published in the last 3 years regarding human rights challenges in palm oil production, specifically in Indonesia and Malaysia, that accounts for the vast part or the majority of the world's total production of palm oil. So I was wondering, I'm going to start with this first question. So it can be to both Mr. Pai and Mr. Gottwald and Mr. Savi, you can participate as well. So the question is, what has been the impact of palm oil production on human rights? And what are the different situations in which human rights challenges can occur in palm oil production in Indonesia? If you want to start first, Mr. Gottwald, and then Mr. Pai, you can continue.
Sure. I mean, that's a
yeah, it's a very broad question. I'm sorry.
very broad question, and
Yeah.
I won't pretend to answer all of it.
Yeah.
But what I've, from my experience, when you step back and look at the range of human rights impacts, it sort of starts with the way that land is acquired. And there are many problems and challenges in the palm oil industry with the way land is acquired, particularly regarding what is called FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent.
Yes.
Yeah. So that there are many ongoing conflicts where people, particularly indigenous people who were previously using land and community-based land that have been moved off this land and now must struggle to have a livelihood and are sort of, have filed complaints and other things. So there's this initial problem at the start of creating a plantation.
Yes.
And perhaps sometimes plantations are also planted on land that is perhaps was used for something else and does not have this problem of indigenous people who may have been using it before. But then after the acquisition of the land, after 5 years, the palm oil is ready to be harvested, and that's where a lot of the labor challenges come in. And in our work, I guess we've noticed a handful of common labor abuses in the palm industry in Indonesia. One of them has to do with the use of casual workers. These are basically workers who are hired. They don't have a normal contract. They are hired on a day-to-day basis, and they therefore don't have any certainty about how many hours or days they will work any given month, and many times don't have access to benefits that permanent workers are able to obtain. So there's a bit of a structural challenge with the way workers are employed in the Indonesian palm oil industry, and so that's something that we've been working on through the Palm Oil Innovation Group. We have, the POIG has a recommended standard of plantations must hire no more than 20% of their workers on these casual contracts. And that's a recognition that I think it's not to say that 20% is the magic number, but it's a recognition that perhaps some casual labor is acceptable and necessary, but there ought to be limits, because when too many workers are employed on a casual basis, the potential benefits of palm oil in terms of creating good jobs are really undermined. So that 20% threshold is something that we've been promoting for the industry writ large, particularly for sustainable palm oil. After that, there are many other issues, of course, that Oliver can talk about with particular to migrant workers. And we know that there are migrant workers on Indonesian plantations. We should remember that wherever the plantations are expanding, and that could be in Papua, it could be in Borneo. When there are new plantations in remote areas, many times the plantation companies cannot or will not employ locals. And so they recruit migrant laborers from other areas of Indonesia. And there are always questions over who pays the transport costs and the fees that are associated with moving workers from one island to another island. Where will they live? Will they start their jobs in debt to the plantation? All these issues can create real problems of potential forced labor, and there have been many cases over the last few years that have been very, I think, bad for the image of the industry. And of course, outside of Indonesia, in Malaysia, there's a major problem with abuse of migrant workers. But we're talking about Indonesia, so we'll keep it there. The last thing I want to mention very briefly is the challenge with child labor and unpaid labor. The Indonesian industry also uses production quotas, where each harvester has to meet a quota. And what we've been able to find is that the quotas are often simply too high for one harvester to meet. And what happens is that harvester will bring their spouse or their child, or they will hire somebody from the area to help them meet that quota, or to meet the bonus above the quota. And this is a structural problem in our view, because you now have people working on the plantation who do not have a employment relationship with the plantation. They have no employment status. And harvesting palm plantations are not the safest places. There are pesticides. Many times it is very, very hot out. It's not a place, it's a place where you can be injured. It's not a place for children to be working. So there's also this question over how the industry, the Indonesian industry and the RSPO addresses the issue of quotas. So just to summarize, I think a few big employment issues facing the RSPO and the Indonesian palm industry. This issue of casual workers, the issue of quotas, and the issue of having proper recruitment of migrant workers, where we can ensure that they are not paying for their transport or their jobs, and they end up in debt when they begin the job.
Eric has sketched the main problems, but I think if we talk about human rights, then we're mainly talking about labor rights now. And just to give the context of that, in 1965, Suharto came to power and massacred 1 or 2 million people, and a lot of these people were the organizers, the trade union activists in the plantations in industry in Indonesia. And this is the backdrop to it all. So So what we see is that for a long, long time, the labor movement was crushed in Indonesia. And since the fall of Suharto, the labor movement has been, organizing, but the palm oil industry remains one of those sectors which is very weakly organized. And the companies, a lot of the companies involved were conglomerates that, became big under Suharto. And the other ones are big investors from Singapore and Malaysia. Now, what they did was basically use the kind of neoliberal setting after the Asian crisis to implement a precarious labor regime. So this is a systematic thing. It's a political project which is not implemented by individual companies, but by industry as a whole. They have very, very good connections to government on the national and local levels, and basically they've introduced a labor regime where workers, it's difficult for workers to set up free and independent trade unions. The wages are oriented towards the minimum wage, which is not the same as a decent living wage, and this is a systematic thing. So, I mean, the big palm oil companies are really making millions and millions, and this is, of course, because the rate of exploitation is so high in the industry, and this is something which the companies, are basically committed to because it's their business model. So I think what Eric was talking about, the child labor, the daily workers, women workers who are usually given, just casual jobs, etc. This is because the rate of the normal wage is so low that, the workers are forced to try and achieve the targets, are forced to try and, make money on the side with their family members. So the whole issue about child labor, it's not a question of one or two companies who are sort of bad apples. It's actually a systematic thing that comes out of this wage labor, low wage labor regime. Sorry.
I think I agree with all the issues that were raised. I think if I have one more that I would like to raise, the issue of gender. That maybe has not been mentioned, and that is becoming more and more at the center of the dialogues that we're having in terms of the revision of the standard of the RSPO that is happening right now. Yeah. I think the issue of gender is something that has been not very much talked about, even as of today, not only on palm oil and on oil palm, but also in other agricultural commodities. I think there's a lot of issues, not just with the rights of women, and in terms of women that are pregnant, for example, they have to work, in terms of maternity leave, in terms of women that have to work when they're indisposed because of sexual related conditions. But also in terms of sexual harassment, we know we've had instances of this in the sector. But I would like to also note that all the instances and cases that we have discussed are, of course, present in the oil palm sector, but I don't think it would change if we change the plant that we're cultivating. So I think it's good to raise the issues. It's also good to understand what are the solutions, and it's good to know that there's people working on this, such as the panelists that we have in the call, and that we have the chance to discuss it. Unfortunately, I know that in other commodities that could easily replace palm oil, for example, in Indonesia, this discussion has not even happened, not even started. So it's good to look at the issues that we have, and I hope that we can also look at what we can do to make it better. There's different approaches on the ways that we can do this, and maybe we can discuss some tonight.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for your comment. Yeah, I think that's very relevant. Mr. Gottwald, Mr. Pai, do you have any reply regarding this?
No, I mean, just to say that I agree with Stefano that the gender issue is important. I'll just say that there is a link between gender and this issue of casual work. If you look at most of the big palm oil growers, if you look at maybe half their workers are permanent, maybe less, depending on the grower. Most of those permanent workers are men. And then if you look at the casual workers, the majority of casual workers are women. So there is a gender angle to women tend to get the lowest paying, least secure, most precarious jobs on the plantation. And of course, this is a big challenge for the industry.
I see. Good. Thank you very much.
Can I add something?
Oh, yes, of course. You can add. No problem.
Okay, one of the gender issues is, of course, that women workers are the ones who spray the pesticides usually as casual workers. Now, one of the pesticides they use, I'm sure you know, is paraquat, which is banned in Europe. And there's an NGO in Malaysia which did serious studies on this. And it has a bigger effect on women's bodies because of the fatty tissue constellation or something like that. So now the interesting thing about that is that the head of this NGO, Irene Fernandez, who has now passed away, tried to get the RSPO to commit to not using paraquat. And this was rejected at the General Assembly a few years ago. So, you know, you can talk about gender, but then if, you know, one of these key issues, these members, the big corporations, members of the RSPO are actually lobbying their, you know, governments to not ban paraquat. So that's one of the issues there. And I mean, I'm sure we'll discuss further as we go on about what we can do about it, how we can, you know, support the struggle for human rights in the palm oil industry. And I think what I would say that it's been framed as the only way to do it is to work within the RSPO, is to work with companies to improve their management of plantations, etc. And I think it's a very dangerous framing, because it actually orientates civil society towards this kind of privatizing of governance structures, and orientates them away from building, you know, social movements and actually talking to the labor side rather than the capital side of the business.
Okay.
I see. Thank you. Yeah, Stefano, I'll let you comment on this.
Well, it's true that the issue of paraquat was discussed on the 2013 review and was not approved. I won't go into politicizing the discussion, but maybe one thing that I can say is that we have published an impact report last year. So we can see a list of the companies within the RSPO that have voluntarily decided not to use paraquat, and that have a policy not to use paraquat. And if you look at the standard that is under review now for the second public consultation, which is a public consultation, meaning that everyone can comment on the standard for the RSPO, you will see that one of the topics that has been discussed is the topic of elimination of paraquat. So this new standard will be revised. It's now the second and last revision before the end of the year. So hopefully the industry can move on. I think on the point, I would disagree on the point of, you know, better not have the RSPO. I wonder what would happen. I mean, what would have happened if the RSPO wasn't there? I was talking today with someone from an NGO, Tenaganita, that is working on Malaysia. And I mean, I won't speak on his behalf because Joseph is not here, but companies, for example, in Malaysia, and I'm pretty sure it's the issue in Indonesia as well, when we discuss labor unions, for example, there was a practice to have it in the contracts of workers to not allow workers to join labor unions. And I would like to think that one of the reasons why now companies allow this to be in the contract, although there might be still issues, and I'm pretty aware of the issues that there are in terms of coercing, for example, workers into not joining labor unions, but at least in terms of moving the policies and moving the discussion on with these companies to know that joining labor unions is actually a good thing, for example, and this should be an issue that is discussed, happened because of the RSPO. And because we have companies that otherwise would be very happy to do their business as usual and win and sell their products to India, which is the main importer of palm oil, and to China, where today there's no requirement for sustainability whatsoever. So I would like to think that although not perfect, RSPO has played a role in this, and we've also grown better, I think, in engaging with labor unions. For example, we have a labor task force within the RSPO now that has got input also from Serbundo, for example, and OPUC, that were two of the participants. Well, one of the participants was supposed to join today. I don't know if they will join later. And I'm sure that it won't be perfect, but at least it's progress. And if not a company, at least there's someone like myself that is willing to join a discussion like this of today and get the criticism and discuss about it. And I hope that that's a value as well.